It was March 7, 1945, 10,000 feet above the western Pacific. Captain Jerry Yellin guided his P-51 Mustang toward a gray volcanic lump called Iwo Jima. He had named his plane the Dory R after a girl back home, a girl he hoped to marry if he survived. But survival seemed a long shot now. Below him, the island was still a war zone. Marines had been fighting for 2 weeks, and thousands of them were already dead. The Japanese still held 2/3 of the island. As Yellin lined up for landing, he saw the airstrip at the base of Mount Suribachi. The runway was dirt and ash, surrounded by the wreckage of war. He put the Mustang down hard, feeling the wheels grab the volcanic surface. When he opened the canopy, the stench hit him like a physical blow. Dead Japanese soldiers were piled 6 feet high along the runway, rotting in the warm sun. He had to fight the urge to vomit. That first night, Jerry Yellin did not sleep. He lay in a foxhole he had dug himself, using a shovel the Marines had given him. The stench of death filled his nostrils. Thousands of flies buzzed overhead, feasting on the bodies. Mortars thumped in the distance, and machine gun fire crackled across the island. He could hear men screaming, dying calls for their mothers. The ground itself was hot, heated by volcanic sulfur springs. A ghostly mist rose from the foxholes, giving cover to Japanese infiltrators who might slip in and cut a man's throat. Yellin gripped his pistol and stayed awake, listening to every sound. He had never felt so powerless. In the cockpit, he was a killer. Here, in a hole in the ground, he was prey. For the next 8 days, Yellin and his squadron flew low-level strafing runs against Japanese positions. The Mustangs carried 650 caliber machine guns, and the pilots aimed them at caves and trenches where the enemy was hiding. The Marines had marked targets with yellow smoke, and the P-51s came in 10 feet off the ground, pouring fire into the earth. But the Japanese were dug deep, so the pilots started building their own napalm bombs. They dropped them on the island, turning whole sections into flaming infernos. By March 15th, the Mustangs had flown their last close air support mission. The remaining Japanese had retreated so far underground that only the Marines could root them out. The squadron had proved itself. Now, they waited for orders to strike Japan itself. Days earlier, on the morning of March 11th, a mission had been launched against Chichijima, a Japanese stronghold whose strategic value was matched only by its reputation for brutality. The island housed a powerful radio station that broadcast warnings to Japan whenever American planes approached. And every downed pilot captured by the garrison was executed. Some were even cannibalized. The group commander of the 15th Fighter Group led 17 Mustangs from the 47th Squadron north toward the island. A Navy Catalina circled offshore, ready to pull any downed pilot from the sea. The mountainous silhouette of Chichijima rose from the water as the Americans approached from the east, keeping the rising sun at their backs. The Mustangs dove on the airstrip, releasing 500-pound bombs into the graded runway where 4 Japanese planes sat parked. Anti-aircraft fire climbed from the island, but the pilots pressed their attack. Yellow Flight turned its fury on the harbor, strafing vessels moored at Shiomi Point and disabling several seaplanes before they could get airborne. The entire force returned to Iwo Jima without losing a single aircraft. The airfield was cratered, enemy aircraft were strafed on the ground with unknown results, and the seaplane base was crippled. It was a clean victory, and it proved that the Mustangs could strike Japanese strongholds at will. 2 weeks later, on the evening of March 25th, Captain Ernest Thomas climbed into his P-61 Black Widow at Central Field. The twin-engine night fighter carried radar, a new technology that let its crew see enemy aircraft in the dark. By 10:15, the green screens showed nothing but the 8 Black Widows on patrol over the island. 15 minutes later, ground radar detected Japanese bombers approaching from the north. Thomas's radar officers spotted a Betty, a Japanese twin-engine bomber, on their own screen, and the crew began a chase through the moonlit sky. 3 times they found the bomber and lost it again, fuel running lower each moment. Thomas finally closed to 600 feet and squeezed the trigger. The Betty's left engine burst into flame, and the bomber fell toward the sea. Thomas landed back on Iwo Jima with empty tanks, having prevented the bombing run. Just hours later, in the darkness before dawn on March 26th, the Japanese, who were supposed to be gone, emerged from their tunnels. A mortar shell tore through the tent of Colonel Ken Powell, collapsing it on top of the wounded commander. Across the camp, Japanese soldiers crawled out of bomb craters and began throwing grenades into the tents where pilots still slept. The shattered pillbox near the camp's edge became a final Japanese stronghold until a Marine tank rolled up and blasted it apart. By 9 in the morning, 98 Japanese bodies lay inside the compound, with another 232 scattered across the ravines nearby. 44 Americans were dead, including 11 pilots. Colonel Powell survived his wounds and was evacuated from the island. The survivors understood that this war would not end until the enemy was destroyed on his own soil. 4 days later, on March 30th, General Mickey Moore ordered 100 Mustangs into the air for a round-trip test flight to Saipan. The distance matched the planned run to Japan, and he needed to know if the planes could manage the journey. The pilots climbed out over the Pacific and set course south. Mechanical problems plagued the formation from the start. Planes lost power, oil pressure dropped, engines sputtered and failed. Nearly half the Mustangs could not complete the full distance, either landing in Saipan or turning back early. Jerry Yellin was one of the pilots who made it all the way to Saipan and back without a single problem. His Mustang held together, his fuel burned true, and he landed on Iwo Jima with the round trip complete. He hoped the commanding officers would remember his name when they chose pilots for the real mission. On the evening of April 6th, Major Jim Van de Hay called the men of the 78th together in the squadron Quonset hut. The rain that had grounded them for days had finally broken. Van de Hay looked at his pilots and told them they would fly to Japan in the morning. 108 Mustangs would escort the B-29s to Tokyo, with 16 planes from each squadron flying in formation. The target was the Nakajima aircraft engine factories west of the capital. Van de Hay began reading the names of the pilots who would go, and when he said Yellin's name, the young captain felt a surge of electricity. The intelligence officer laid out the flight plan, climb to 30,000 feet, guard the bombers from above, and stay with them until the bombs dropped. The memory of the Banzai attack still hung in the air, but the pilots were ready. They were going to Japan at last. The morning of April 7th broke clear over Iwo Jima. Major Jim Tapp led the men of the 78th Squadron off the runway, 108 Mustangs lifting into the early light to join the B-29s. They crossed the coast of Japan at 10,000 feet. Yellin saw Mount Fuji rising in the distance, a fixed point in a sky that would soon fill with fire. Tapp spotted enemy fighters climbing to intercept the bombers. He pushed his throttle forward, nosed his Mustang into a dive, and within minutes shot down a Tony and then a second enemy plane. The squadron held its formation while the B-29s unloaded their payload on the Nakajima engine plants. The Armada turned south for the long flight home, every pilot checking his fuel gauge. They had covered 1,600 miles round trip, the longest single-engine fighter mission ever flown in the Pacific. The debriefing confirmed 21 Japanese planes destroyed. Tapp claimed 3 kills of his own. The men of the 78th had proved they could reach Japan, strike its heart, and return. But the cost of each mission was still being counted. 5 days later, on April 12th, the squadron climbed out again over Tokyo. Tapp spotted a Tony moving into position and rolled his Mustang into a dive. He squeezed the trigger, and his .650 caliber guns hammered the enemy fighter. A stream of smoking brass casings spun from the breeches of his wing guns. They tumbled through the slipstream and were sucked directly into the air intake of First Lieutenant Fred White's Mustang, who was flying tight on his lead's wing. White's engine seized almost instantly. Tapp recognized the disaster and guided him out over the bay, hoping for a submarine rescue. White climbed from the cockpit and pulled his ripcord, but the parachute failed to unfurl. He struck the water at full speed and died on impact. The squadron lost 3 pilots that day. Fred White was the first of Jerry Yellin's close friends to fall in combat, and Tapp carried the weight of that death for the rest of the war. The weeks that followed blurred into a rhythm of missions against Chichijima and the Japanese homeland. Replacement pilots arrived to fill the empty bunks, and among them was a skinny, brown-headed kid from Georgia named First Lieutenant Danny Mathis. He had graduated from Clemson University the year before and played a mean shortstop on the squadron softball team. Yellin took him under his wing, flying with him, teaching him to stay tight in formation. On May 29th, the squadron escorted hundreds of B-29s in a firebombing raid against the port city of Yokohama. Yellin spotted a Zero cutting across the formation and broke hard to engage, with Mathis glued to his wing. They fired together, stitching the enemy plane with 50 caliber fire, and watched it roll over and fall toward the city below. It was Yellin's first aerial victory of the war and Mathis's as well. They circled back to the formation, and for a moment the war felt like something they could survive. On June 1st, the squadron was ordered to strike Osaka, with all three fighter groups flying together for the first time. Yellin had been grounded by the squadron dentist for emergency wisdom tooth surgery. Danny Mathis volunteered to take his place, strapping into the cockpit of the WWII. The formation flew into a monster storm 300 miles north of Iwo Jima, a solid wall of clouds that reached from the sea to the stratosphere. The pilots tried to climb over the front, but the storm swallowed them whole. Planes collided in the blinding whiteness, wings tore from fuselages, and parachutes opened inside the clouds. 27 Mustangs and their pilots vanished into the Pacific that day. Danny Mathis was among them, killed in a mid-air collision 3 days before his 23rd birthday. Yellin had lost his wingman, his friend, and the plane he had flown since his first day over Iwo Jima. He wondered how many more friends the war would take before it ended. On the morning of July 3rd, Captain Jerry Yellin led a flight of 8 Mustangs north toward Chichijima. Flying on his wing was First Lieutenant Dick Schruppel, a fellow New Jersey native and one of Yellin's closest friends in the squadron. They had trained together, flown together, and shared the same dry humor that marked men who lived on borrowed time. The target was the airstrip, as always. Yellin pushed the Dory R-2 into a steep dive, and Schruppel followed. Tracers from Japanese anti-aircraft guns rose to meet them, stitching the air with lines of fire. Yellin pulled up and circled back over the harbor. He saw Schruppel's plane trailing flame. The young pilot managed to bail out and inflate his life raft, paddling desperately through the surf. For 2 hours, American Mustangs poured fire onto the cliffs to keep the Japanese at bay. A B-17 dropped a Higgins lifeboat. An OA-10 Catalina, piloted by Captain Robert B. Richardson of the Army Air Forces, deliberately landed under heavy enemy fire. The flight surgeon looked down from the blister and saw Schruppel riddled with bullets. He was dead. The circling Mustangs then fired a final burst into the boat, sinking it, so his body would never fall into Japanese hands. 5 days later, on July 8th, the squadron flew a strafing mission against airfields near Tokyo. Yellin's friend, Captain Al Sharon, was among the pilots. He and Yellin had been together since flight school in Phoenix. Through the long months in Hawaii, through every mission on Iwo Jima, they had traded cigarettes and jokes and shared 100 quiet evenings. Now Sharon was gone. His voice came over the radio, once hit, unable to see. Then silence. His plane crashed into the Pacific. No parachute, no rescue. That evening, Yellin performed the hardest duty he had faced since the war began. He packed the clothing and personal effects of Al Sharon and another lost pilot, Bob Carr, into footlockers to be shipped home. He folded the jackets, the spare shirts, the photographs. Each item carried the weight of a life that would never return. The squadron's roster was shrinking. The faces around the mess tent were younger now, replacements who had not known the men who had fallen. On the afternoon of August 6th, Yellin returned from a mission over Tokyo and taxied his Mustang to a stop. Phil Marr, another pilot, came running across the field, arms waving. He shouted that the war was over. A single bomb had wiped out a city. The men gathered around the radio, hearing the first reports of something called the atom bomb. A wave of hope swept through the camp, but the Japanese did not surrender. The rumors faded, and the flight schedules remained on the board. 2 more bombs fell. Nagasaki vanished on August 9th. President Truman went on the radio and warned that the United States would continue using this weapon until Japan surrendered or ceased to exist. Still, no capitulation came. The men of the 78th watched the calendar turn, wondering how many more of them would die while the enemy debated surrender terms they had already rejected. On the evening of August 14th, Major Jim Tapp called the squadron together. Another mission was ordered for the following day. The mood in the Quonset hut was grim. A different young pilot, First Lieutenant Phil Schlamberg, sat beside Yellin. Schlamberg was 19 years old. a Jewish kid from Brooklyn who had graduated valedictorian of his high school class and scored among the highest aptitude marks ever recorded by the Army. Schlamberg admitted he had a bad feeling, a knot in his stomach he could not shake. He leaned close to Yellin and spoke quietly. "If I go on this mission, Captain, I'm not coming back." Yellin tried to argue. He found Tapp and asked that Schlamberg be excused. Tapp offered a way out, a visit to the flight surgeon, but Schlamberg refused. He would fly. Yellin looked at the young man and saw the certainty in his face. He told him to stay tight on his wing. It was all he could offer. The morning of August 15th broke clear over Iwo Jima. Captain Jerry Yellin climbed into the cockpit of the WWII, his replacement Mustang, and ran through the pre-flight checks. First Lieutenant Phil Schlamberg was already in his plane, parked a few yards away. Yellin glanced over and saw the young pilot from Brooklyn sitting alone behind his canopy, hands on the controls. The squadron had been ordered to attack airfields near Tokyo one more time. The Mustangs lifted off the runway and climbed into a bright blue sky. Yellin led Schlamberg into formation, the two planes flying tight together as they crossed the Pacific. They reached the Japanese coast without incident and dropped their external fuel tanks into the bay. Below them, Mount Fuji rose through the haze. Yellin checked his instruments, then looked over at Schlamberg, who was still holding his position on the wing. They pushed on toward the target. The squadron descended on the airfields and opened fire, strafing runways and parked aircraft. Tracers rose from the ground as the Mustangs made multiple passes over the target. Schlamberg stayed tight on Yellin's wing through every turn. When the ammunition was spent and the fuel gauges read low, Yellin turned the flight toward the coast and began climbing. A bank of clouds appeared ahead. He led the four Mustangs into the white wall and flew by instruments, waiting for clear air on the other side. When Yellin emerged from the clouds, he looked to his wing. Schlamberg was gone. The space where the young pilot had been flying was empty. Yellin scanned the sky. Nothing. No parachute, no smoke, no radio call. He circled back once, then again, but the clouds had closed behind him and there was no sign of the missing plane. The only explanation was anti-aircraft fire that had found its mark while they were blind inside the cloud bank. Yellin flew the remaining miles back to Iwo Jima in silence. He landed the WWII and taxied to a stop. When the propeller stopped spinning, he climbed out and saw that the airfield was strangely quiet. Someone told him the war was over. The Emperor had announced Japan's surrender 3 hours earlier, while Yellin and Schlamberg were still over Tokyo. The code word Ute had been broadcast to every American aircraft in the theater, but the radio set in Yellin's flight had never received it. The men of the 78th gathered on the runway. Some were laughing, some were crying. Yellin stood apart from them, looking out at the empty space where a plane should have been. Phil Schlamberg, 19 years old, valedictorian of his high school class, the youngest of 10 children, was the last American to die in combat in the Second World War. His body was never recovered. His name would later be carved into the tablets of the missing at the Honolulu Memorial alongside thousands of others who vanished into the Pacific. 70 years passed. In the spring of 2015, a 91-year-old man in a khaki uniform stepped onto the black sand of Iwo Jima. His body was frail, but he walked without assistance. The Japanese government had invited the surviving American veterans to return for a reunion. Jerry Yellin looked out at the beach where he had landed in March of 1945, at the mountain where the flag had been raised, at the sky where his friends had vanished. A few elderly Japanese veterans stood nearby. The men who had once been enemies now shared the same ground in peace. Yellin shook their hands. He spoke with them. He listened to the wind blowing across the island. Then he raised his hand to his brow and saluted. It was not a salute to any one man. It was a salute to the invisible dead who remained on that island and beneath the sea. Jim Tapp survived the war and became a senior officer in the Air Force. Danny Mathis and Dick Schruppel were among the 16 pilots Yellin flew with who never came home. Al Sharon was lost over Tokyo. Several who survived the Banzai attack lived to old age. The greatest honor of my life, Yellin said, was to serve my country. He had packed their belongings into footlockers. He had written letters to their families. And now, standing on the same volcanic ash where he had landed 7 decades earlier, he was the last of them. He lowered his hands slowly and stood in silence as the flag above him snapped in the Pacific wind. The story of the final mission of World War II does not end with a celebration of victory in Times Square. It ends with a young pilot from Brooklyn who vanished into a cloud bank over Tokyo, and with the man who flew beside him, carrying that memory for the rest of his life. Jerry Yellin lived to see the enemy become a friend, to see his son marry a Japanese woman, to see a world at peace, and when he returned to Iwo Jima one last time, he stood not as a conqueror, but as a witness. If you have a family story from the Pacific War, or a memory passed down from a father or grandfather who served in that theater, we would like to hear it. Share it in the comments below. We read every one. If you appreciate documentaries that honor the men and women who fought for freedom, please subscribe to this channel and give this video a like. Your support helps us continue telling these stories. Thank you for listening.